The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Read, recorded, and edited by JohnLothe. Chapter 9, Part 3. Age of Conflict. The period of expansion continued until the middle of the 3rd century BC in the western half of classical antiquity, but ended 2 centuries earlier in the eastern half. We can fix these dates with a good deal of confidence, but the mechanism that caused the change is considerably clearer in one case than it is in the other. The dubious instance is the earlier one, in the mid-5th century in the Greek-speaking world. In this earlier case, we can see quite clearly that there was a change from a period of expansion to a period of conflict. Before 450 BC, the 4 usual kinds of expansion, in production, population, geographic extent, and knowledge, are evident, but after that date, they are much less so. On the other hand, 3 of the 4 characteristics of an age of conflict, decreasing rate of economic expansion, increasing class conflicts, imperialist wars, irrationality, seem to be increasingly evident after 450 BC. If we move further away from this demarcation date to compare, for example, 500 BC with 400 BC, or 450 BC with 350 BC, it becomes even clearer that the culture has passed from expansion to conflict. To be sure, there are difficulties, but in some cases, at least, these can be explained away. We must remember that the point at which a civilization, or an area in a civilization, turns from stage 3 to stage 4 is the point at which the rate of expansion ceases to rise and begins to decline. It is not the much later point at which expansion itself ceases and is replaced by contraction. There is thus a considerable length of time between these 2 points during which expansion continues, but with a decreasing rate. In the case of a core area such as Greece, the difficulty in determining the date is increased by the fact that the rate of expansion itself is still continuing to rise in more peripheral areas, such as the Western Mediterranean, and the helpful influence of prosperity there can serve to conceal the less optimistic picture in the older area. Other sources of ambiguity in demarking the 2 stages from each other arise from closely related conditions. The ending of geographic expansion and of the growth of knowledge is difficult to establish in the core of any civilization, as long as that civilization is continuing to expand in its peripheral areas. In fact, the expansion, geographic expansion, can apply only to the society as a whole and could never be established for some limited portion of it. On the other hand, it does seem likely, although the evidence is not available, that the growth of knowledge for the ordinary Greek ceased to increase in the 4th century. The wars, insecurity, and general confusion that became endemic in Greek life after 430 BC must have made it increasingly difficult for the ordinary Greek, that is, the one who lacked the leisure provided by slave ownership, to obtain information. The established methods by which information was diffused in Greek society, through conversation rather than by reading, and thus through such periodic gatherings as the Olympic Games, the Panathenaic Festival, and visits to the local agora, as well as the more irregular intercourse provided by visits from foreign celebrities or journeys to places like the Delphic Oracle. All these weakened as methods of communication for the ordinary, non-slave owning Greek after 430 BC. The possibility of becoming literate or of obtaining information from written works may also have decreased about this time, or a little later, for the non-slave owner. On the other hand, these written sources of information may well have increased in availability for leisured slave owners for a long time after the 5th century BC. If the cessation of the 4 aspects of an age of expansion is difficult to establish for Greece in the 5th century, the advent of at least 3 of the 4 aspects of an age of conflict is easy to demonstrate. There clearly was a decreasing rate of economic expansion, at least after 400 BC, for the economic troubles of Greece in the 4th century and later are notorious. The growth of class conflicts seems equally evident. Of course, it might be argued that such class struggles were always present in Greece, and within limits that is true. Social tensions had reached a very high peak in the period of transition from gestation to full expansion, but had then subsided only to rise again at the transition from expansion to conflict. In Athenian history, where our historical evidence is more adequate than elsewhere, there can be no doubt that social tensions reached a high point in the period between Draco and Solon, say 600 BC, and then subsided to a low point about 500 BC, just before the Persian Wars, only to rise again about 400 BC. Moreover, the kind of class conflict was different in the earlier period than it was in the later one. In the former, the struggle was between the forces of dynamicism and the age of expansion. In the former, the struggle was between the forces of dynamicism of the age of expansion and the efforts of the older dominant groups to prevent change and to maintain the static social conditions of the period of gestation. Draco and his supporters wished to maintain the noble-dominated, self-sufficient, largely pastoral economic units of the earlier period, and sought to resist the growth of such innovations as the expanding money economy, the growth of commerce, the development of city life, the rise of a middle class founded on commerce, the shift to a more democratic military force based on infantry from the older system based on the use of chariots by a hereditary nobility, and the resulting modifications of law and justice inevitable with increased social change. This kind of conflict was based on tensions of development in which older ways of providing for human needs resisted the innovation of new methods for providing for these needs. Such tension is endemic in any dynamic society, and from it, social conflicts can arise at any time. The increased social conflicts that arose after 450 BC were quite different, being caused by tensions of evolution rather than by tensions of development. They did not arise from resistance to change, and even less from unsuccessful resistance to change, but from growing desperation because expansion was slowing up. Of even greater significance, perhaps, is the fact that in this newer evolutionary crisis, the victory was falling more and more to the groups who hated change. This triumph of the reactionaries had occurred occasionally in the earlier period of acute developmental tensions, most notably in Sparta. There, the legislation associated with the name of Lycurgus had stopped the development from an agrarian to a commercial economy and had retained local control of political and social life in the hands of the noble landlord class, at the price of a renunciation of all commercial expansion. But this local reaction had been overcome in the Greek world as a whole by increased expansion elsewhere, as in Corinth or Athens. This is, of course, a clear case of geographic circumvention to a local reactionary triumph. But in the period after 400 BC, in the Greek world, there was a general triumph of the forces of reaction. This can be seen in the victories of Sparta, Thebes, Macedonia, and Rome, all of whom supported the oligarchic groups over the democratic groups in each state they attacked. The growth of class conflict in the period after 430 BC can be seen in the writings of the enemies of democracy, such as Aristophanes, Xenophon, or Plato, but is most clearly shown in Thucydides. The later describes the way in which each state became divided into two classes, the democratic group favorable to Athens and the oligarchic group favorable to Sparta. The bloody reprisals these two groups inflicted on each other provide some of the most violent pages in Greek history. In Corcyra, where the schism appeared in one of its earliest and most unhappy examples, the popular party obtained support from the rural slaves by offering them emancipation, while the oligarchic group hired mercenary fighters from neighboring areas. and each group set out, generally successfully, to massacre the other. Closely related to these growing class conflicts was the increasing evidence of imperialist wars. In the earlier periods, there had been political conflicts, but the economic expansion of each state, either intensively, as a shift from agriculture to commerce and handicrafts, or extensively, as colonial expansion, had usually taken place without head-on collisions. But by 450 BC, expansion was increasingly extensive rather than intensive, and was more and more likely to seek political support for its extension, because more than one group, each backed by its own state, was trying to expand into the same area, or into an area already occupied by a third group. These two modifications in the nature of expansion are characteristic of the shift from a period of expansion to a period of conflict. When an organization becomes institutionalized, it resists structural changes and thus decreases the amount of intensive expansion, which can be achieved only by structural changes, but still seeks to expand extensively by spreading its institutionalized structure over wider areas of exploitation. When numerous groups seek to do this, the limited number of such wider areas makes conflicts arise. Each group seeks to support its extensive expansion by political force, and the result is imperialist war. Indeed, one of the most notable characteristics of any age of conflict is the effort to achieve economic expansion by political rather than by economic means. Here again, Thucydides provides our most reliable evidence. The growing rivalry of diverse economic imperialisms is well shown in his writings, and culminated in the clash between Corinth and Athens in the Adriatic. Athens had come to dominate the commerce of the Aegean in the first half of the 5th century, as Corinth dominated that of the Adriatic. When Athens tried to push into the Adriatic, allying with Corcyra to do so, Corinth called upon its ally, Sparta, and the fierce struggle began. It is clear that this Athenian effort to push a fairly primitive commercial economy into an area already occupied by a similar economy was unnecessary and was a result of the institutionalization of that system. But we do not know enough about the Greek economy of the day to say exactly how the system was institutionalized and how it could have been reformed. We cannot ask of any economic system that it expand beyond the limits of its own technical knowledge or of its own social traits. But we have the right to expect that it utilize these before it seeks to expand by taking wealth from its neighbors. From this point of view, it seems quite evident that Greek agriculture was far from exploiting its available resources when the imperialist wars began in the 5th century. At that time, grain, usually barley, was grown in a two-field system in which the field was left fallow alternate years. This was equivalent to tilling only half the land each year. The fallow was left to recover the nutritive elements in the soil, nitrogen, and to a lesser extent, the moisture. The latter could undoubtedly have been increased to some extent by irrigation, but a lack of private enterprise hampered this. As for the nutritive elements, these could have been increased sufficiently to reduce the fallowing to 1 year in 3, or even to eliminate it completely. The Greeks were fully aware of the nitrogen-providing qualities of leguminous crops. Clover is mentioned in the Odyssey, and alfalfa came from Persia about 480 BC. Other legumes were known, and their function as green manures was fully known to Xenophon and Theophrastus, yet were rarely used. The use of lime, marls, and various volcanic soils as inorganic fertilizers was also known, above all to Theophrastus, yet these improvements were generally neglected. The causes of this neglect are to be attributed to a general lack of enterprise associated with a long-established slave system, and the growing idea that agricultural labor was a menial activity beneath the dignity of free men. A wider use of legumes and of irrigation could have been made the basis for a more intensive use of livestock, and this, in turn, could have led to a considerable increase in the use of meat and cheese in the Greek diet. But as long as so much of agricultural labor was slaves, and these could be fed on barley and fish, there was little incentive to seek improvements in diet. To some extent, such improvements in living were hampered by poor transportation, especially by inadequate harnessing that made it hardly worthwhile to use draft animals, so that heavy work had to be done by slaves. Here again, the existence of slavery undoubtedly discouraged innovation. The slaves had to be fed 365 days in the year, and had to be kept busy, so there was no real profit in any invention that would reduce the work of slaves, since their field work and agriculture kept them busy only a small part of the year. Fields were plowed 4 and 5 times in a year, and each time were plowed over and over again in many directions, until it was no longer possible to see in which direction the plow was last. The clods were broken up with mattocks. Although this used enormous labor, it was recognized that any increase in efficiency would merely have served to increase the periods in which the slaves were idle. It was difficult to turn slaves to other activities such as vine dressing or olive trimming, because these required too much skill for ordinary slaves. In a similar way, deep plowing and drill planting of seed were known to produce superior crops, but were not used for lack of enterprise. On none of these matters can we be very certain of our interpretations, because the facts are rather scanty. But it does seem that the Greek economic system, especially in agriculture, ceased to improve after 400 BC, even though the knowledge that could have made improvements possible was available. Undoubtedly, this has had a considerable influence on the growth of imperialist wars, and seems to indicate that slavery had become an institution. The fourth aspect of any age of conflict, increase in irrationality, is lacking in the Greek world after 450 BC, and was generally rare in classical antiquity, even when this society was clearly deep in its age of conflict. One reason probably lies in the general tendency toward rationality that existed among the Greeks, and that we have tried to attribute to their Indo-European heritage. Of even greater significance was the alliance already mentioned between rationalism and the triumphant oligarchy. The critics of enemies of democracy and of the whole Athenian way of life, with its emphasis on change, commerce, and social equality, formed a motley block made up of the philosophic realists, the conservatives, and rationalists, especially the Pythagoreans, the defenders of nobility, of oligarchy, and of the state's authority, the admirers of Sparta, and the enemies of science. These groups were broken and disorganized for almost a century after the revolt of Croton, 510 BC, and were kept off balance by the long series of political and economic successes of the Athenian democracy. But when these successes were followed by a longer series of disasters after 431 BC, the oligarchic bloc began to organize. It is extremely likely that the nucleus of this revived oligarchic movement came from the Pythagorean refugees in Thebes. In any case, it brought together the diverse groups we have mentioned. The greatest figure in this group was Plato, who, like Anaxagoras, a century earlier in the opposing bloc, combined many diverse trends. The writings of Plato remain as the most successful statement of the oligarch rationalist position, although it is frequently stated even more explicitly elsewhere, as in some of the earlier works of Aristotle, when he was still a Platonic rationalist, especially the first book of the Politics. The rivalry between these two blocks appeared repeatedly in the public controversies of Athens during the century 450 to 350 BC, and even later. The condemnation of Anaxagoras about 450 BC was as much an event in this struggle as was the trial and conviction of Pericles in 430 BC. So also was the execution of Socrates, 399 BC, and Plato's reaction to this deed by founding the Academy on endowments that continued for 914 years, 385 BC to AD 529. There were three basic ideas of this oligarchic group. 1. That change was evil, superficial, illusory, and fundamentally impossible. 2. That all material things were misleading, illusory, distracting, and not worth seeking. And 3. That all rationally demonstrable distinctions, including those in social position, especially slavery, were based on real unchanging differences and not upon accidental or conventional distinctions. These three ideas together would serve to stop all efforts at social change, economic reform, or political equality. These ideas, which we might sum up under some such comprehensive term as Pythagorean rationalism, were, of course, not irrational, yet they led ultimately to mysticism and served the same purpose of providing an ideology for the vested interest groups that irrational thinking usually does in the age of conflict of any civilization. In the age of conflict of classical antiquity, these ideas generally triumphed, although they were challenged generally with little effect by the later Aristotle after 343 BC, by Epicurus and Lucretius, and by numerous minor thinkers in the late Hellenistic and Roman periods. When in the later period, some of the sophist ideas, such as the conventional nature of slavery, became widely accepted, they were combined, as in Stoicism, with resignation and acceptance of the external appearances of things to a degree that entirely canceled the dynamic and progressive influence they had possessed when advocated by the sophists. It might be pointed out at this time that the triumph of the vested interest groups, the oligarchy, in the struggles of the age of conflict of classical civilization resulted in the social, political, and economic triumph of the oligarchy over the progressive and revolutionary forces. This led to the survival of the works of the intellectual supporters of oligarchy, such as Plato, Xenophon, and Cicero, and to the loss of most of the works of the opposite side, such as the writings of the sophists and Ionian scientists. The rich were willing to pay for making copies of works favoring their position and would not pay for copying of opposition works. Thus we have today the writings of Pindar and Xenophon, but have lost those of Anaxagoras and Epicurus. Moreover, it should be pointed out that the oligarchic victory over the forces of progress and equality did not ensure survival to the victors in the long run, or the ending of the opposition's ideology. Quite the contrary. The military tyranny that arose as a consequence of the oligarchy's efforts to maintain slavery and social inequality by force eventually took over the control of classical society in its own name and liquidated the oligarchy and the classical culture it had maintained. In a similar way, the ideological writings of the supporters of oligarchy survived, but many of the ideas of their nominalist opponents became generally accepted. Thus individualism, the natural equality of all men, the conventional and unnatural character of slavery, and the belief that social distinctions rested on force rather than on real differences became generally accepted in the stage of universal empire, but without in any way destroying the continued existence as institutions of slavery, social inequality, law, or public authority. Of course, in the very long run, with the disappearance of these institutions, it might be argued that the ideas that challenged them won out. But this occurred only with the death of classical society as a whole. It would seem then that the period after 450 BC, in the Eastern Mediterranean at least, had the chief, if not all, features of an age of conflict. Similarly, the following period in the Eastern Mediterranean had many of the features of an age of universal empire. These latter features continued from the establishment of Macedonian supremacy in the 7th decade of the 4th century until the disruption of Alexander's empire and the growing power of Rome through the Eastern Mediterranean, back into the belated age of conflict still continuing in the Western Mediterranean, until 146 BC. The imperialist wars of the Eastern Mediterranean's local age of conflict continued almost without interruption from the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC to the conquests of Alexander the Great a century later. Chief events in this period were the Spartan triumph over Athens in 404 BC, the Theban victory over Sparta in 371 BC, and the Macedonian conquest of all Greece at Chaeronea in 338 BC. The conquests of Alexander the Great during the following 15 years established a core, or preliminary universal empire, and some of the features of this fifth stage in the evolution of civilization continued, in spite of the subsequent breakup of that empire among the Diadochi. The chief of these features was the creation of a far-flung commercial unity that encouraged distant trade and geographic division of labor. In a full universal empire, such as existed in the Roman Empire under Antoninus, this would have been carried on to include a single monetary system, a unified legal system, and other aspects of unified rule, and would have given rise to a period of peace and prosperity to which we apply the term Golden Age. In Alexander's system, this Golden Age was never reached because the core empire was disrupted and its temporary beneficial effects were obliterated by the intrusion into the Eastern Mediterranean of the age of conflict still going on in the Western Mediterranean. The age of expansion in the Western Mediterranean lasted from the 7th century to the middle of the 3rd century, and thus continued for 200 years after expansion had begun to decline in the East. It was, on the whole, somewhat different from the earlier expansion in the East, being more agricultural than commercial and more dependent on slavery. Moreover, non-indigenous peoples like the Etruscans and the Carthaginians made very considerable contributions to it. From the Etruscans, for example, came valuable contributions in regard to irrigation and drainage, while the Carthaginians developed the use of plantation slavery, especially in Sicily. Plantation slavery, which refers to the use of gangs of slaves on large estates, was always rare in Greece, but became in the West the admired form of agrarian organization. It also became the mechanism by which the slave system was changed from an instrument of expansion to an institution of conflict. In the earlier period, when agrarian units were still small, they were worked by citizen soldiers, frequently helped by slaves. Hesiod in Greece, about 700 BC, and Cincinnatus in Italy would be examples of such farmers. The story of how Cincinnatus was summoned from his plow to be dictator of Rome when it was attacked by the Equi in 458 BC, and how he returned to his work after a victorious 16-day campaign, is significant on two counts. It shows the amateur and temporary status of Roman soldiers at this early period, and it shows that an important citizen worked in the fields himself. By 200 BC, the citizen soldier and the family-sized farm were both beginning to vanish from Italy. The ravages of Hannibal and his invasion of Italy during the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, had destroyed buildings, equipment, and livestock beyond the ability of the ordinary peasant to replace them. Moreover, these peasants had been away from their farms for years and had difficulty returning to the onerous routine of peasant life. The overseas conquests resulting from the war required a permanent standing army. This was recruited from the uprooted peasants of Italy. The farms of these displaced peasants were purchased by war profiteers or larger landlords who had made money from war contracts or war booty and were in a position to buy the ravaged Italian farms, combine them into large estates, and equip them with buildings and livestock from their wartime profits. The captives taken in the war provided slaves with which these new estates could be worked. This process was encouraged by a number of other factors. In Sicily, which had been annexed from Carthage in 240, and in Africa, which was acquired 40 years later, the Romans found a functioning agrarian system based on large estates. These were copied in Italy and later in Spain, in accordance with the methods of the Carthaginian agricultural writer Mago, whose works were translated into Latin in the 2nd century BC. The Roman government was unable to pay off the debts incurred during the Second Punic War except by alienating public lands to the speculators and profiteers, who were the chief creditors. Other public lands were transformed into latifundia by tenancy or by simple usurpation. Once Sicily and Africa were acquired, Italy found it difficult to compete with these new territories in raising grain. Accordingly, the farmlands of Italy were shifted from grain to the production of olive oil, wool, and wine. Grain could be raised on both large and small farms, and by persons who had large or small amounts of capital. Olives and wool could be raised only on large holdings, and only by persons with considerable capital. Thus the shift from family farms to great estates was encouraged in Italy, by the shift from grain to olives and wool. One last but important factor in this change to large estates was the fact that land ownership carried an appearance of aristocracy and social prestige, since the nobility were by law excluded from commerce and restricted their economic activities to agriculture. As a result, every parvenu who made money in commerce, industry, speculation, or war contracts sought to win public sanction of his rise in the social scale by acquiring a large estate. The larger, the better. In this way, many persons with no direct knowledge or interest in farming became owners of latifundia, worked by slaves, in charge of a steward. In consequence, there grew up a pattern of ostentatious display of landed luxury, great debts, and separation of management from ownership. This new pattern of agrarian organization created a demand for slaves that could hardly be satisfied. No slave system has ever been able to continue to function on the slaves provided by its own biological reproduction, because the rate of human reproduction is too slow, and the expense from infant mortality and years of unproductive upkeep of the young make this prohibitively expensive. This relationship is one of the basic causes of the American Civil War, and was even more significant in destroying ancient Rome. The normal method for supplying the slave needs of classical antiquity was by sales of war captives. But even this was not sufficient to meet the demand. It was, however, sufficient to make war an endemic element in Roman life. The supply of slaves had to be supplemented by other means. The Senate, which was the chief organ of government and in control of the landed rather than of the commercial classes, permitted piracy to flourish in the Mediterranean, because it supplied captives to the slave marts. This continued until the middle of the 1st century BC, when the revolutionary threat from the discontented to break up the latifundia forced the owners of the estates to seek support from the commercial groups by wiping out the piracy that preyed on commerce. The ease with which piracy was suppressed by Pompey in 67 BC is evidence of the lack of effort made in this task earlier. The supply of slaves was also increased by systemic plundering of the Roman provinces and the territories of allied states. Cicero tells us that each provincial governor had to return after his brief rule with 3 fortunes peculated from the province. One went to pay the bribes that had obtained his appointment. A second went to obtain acquittal from the charges brought against him on his return, and the third was for himself. A similar behavior was found among lesser provincial officials, especially the tax collectors, who often left an area ruined and depopulated. Allied territories were not treated much better than provinces. About 104 BC, Marius called upon the allied king Nicomedes of Bithynia to provide auxiliary troops for services against the Cimbri. The king replied that he was unable to do so because of the depopulation of his country by the slave raiding of Roman officials. When this message reached Rome, the Senate ordered that enslaved freeborn citizens of Roman allies who were being held in Roman provinces should be freed. But after 800 were freed in Sicily, Within a few days, the landlords were able to exercise sufficient political pressure to stop execution of the decree. As a consequence of such methods, the number of slaves increased greatly in the period of the late Republic, and the danger of slave revolts increased accordingly. William L. Westerman and Tenny Frank agree that at least 250,000 war captives were enslaved in the first 50 years of the 2nd century BC. Livy tells us that 70,000 slaves participated in the Sicilian slave revolt of 135 BC. 20,000 were armed by the rebels in the Social War in 90 BC, while Spartacus, who refused help from many, led 120,000 against the city in 72 BC. In 37 BC, Octavius Caesar trained 20,000 slaves obtained from his supporters to be oarsmen in his struggle with Sextus Pompeius, and after his victory, he restored to their owners 30,000 slaves who had been serving with his defeated opponent. This great increase in the number of slaves after 250 BC did not reflect any increase in their productive use. On the contrary, all the evidence indicates that larger and larger numbers were used in quite non-productive activities, attending their masters, lolling about urban residences, or carrying letters and packages. Moreover, between Cato, who wrote in his De Agricultura about 160 BC, and Varro, who wrote in his Rerum Rusticorum, there was a definite shift from a rigorous profit motivation to a more humane and leisurely attitude toward slaves. Even on the land itself, there was a decrease in efficiency. The shift of managerial decisions from an owner on the spot who had a personal interest in efficiency to a freeman overseer who had no such interest does much to explain the mechanism by which the slave-based agricultural system changed from an instrument to institution. The owner, of course, had a personal concern in increase of output because each increase occurred to him, but an overseer had an interest in a stable output year by year, something quite different. If an agricultural unit is operated at peak human efficiency, its output will fluctuate from year to year by a considerable amount, depending on climate conditions. In such a case, the overseer of an absentee landlord would have obtained only a modicum of praise in good years, since the high output was attributed to the weather, but would get a maximum of blame in poor years, on the argument that he should have been able to anticipate or compensate for adverse weather conditions. Under such fluctuations, the overseer would have a precarious tenure and would frequently have been discharged. On the other hand, if the farm had a fairly consistent output year after year within narrow limits of fluctuation, the owner would have secured an annual income on which he could depend, and the overseer would have a relatively secure tenure. For this reason, there was a general tendency for each agricultural unit to approach a fixed annual output. Such a steady output could be obtained only by stabilizing around the output of the poorer years, since it could not be done around the output of the better years. This means that the overseer drove his slaves hard if a year's output seemed likely to fall below his present annual output figure, but relaxed discipline whenever it became clear that the year's output was likely to exceed the same preset annual output goal. The amount of output lost in the latter years, the meteorologically better ones, was always more than the amount of output gained by driving hard in the years when output would be naturally lower, since the preset annual figure was closer to the lower output years than the higher output years of the farm under efficient management. The net result of all this was a reduction and stabilization of output on large estates of absentee owners. As the number of such estates increased, the output of the whole economy suffered. This reduction of output for the system as a whole probably did not occur until after the time of Augustus, or even later, and was concealed for a long time by the fact that the Roman political system was expanding geographically over larger and larger areas, and thus obtaining control of larger and larger absolute amounts of agricultural produce, even when the economic system as a whole was not producing more each year, but less. It is, however, very likely that the Mediterranean economic system as a whole reached its highest rate of expansion before 300 BC and was operating at a decreasing rate of expansion by 250 BC. From 200 BC to AD 200, its absolute output increased only slightly, and by the later date, economic decline in absolute output had begun. Accordingly, the age of conflict for the Western Mediterranean began by 250 BC, and the period of decay for the whole civilization began about AD 200. Universal Empire. The universal empire of classical civilization was achieved with the establishment of the political supremacy of Rome throughout the Mediterranean in 146 BC. The rise of Rome had little to do with the age of expansion. Rome began as an Etruscan bridgehead on the south bank of the Tiber, at a place where several hills on that bank made it possible to defend a ford that crossed the river by way of an island. Thus, from its earliest origin, the Roman organization was militarized. Its political expansion, coinciding with the decline of the Etruscans, was dominated by military considerations. By 250 BC, when the shift from an age of expansion to an age of conflict gave an increased role to any militarized system, Rome was ready to play that role. Until that moment, the usual features of an age of expansion were obvious: increased production, increased population, increased geographic area for classical culture as a whole, and increased knowledge. Of the lesser attributes of this period, democracy is manifest, although science is less so. After 250 BC, the attributes of an age of conflict became clear: class conflict, imperialist wars, irrationality, and declining democracy. All these acted and reacted on the agrarian slave system, increasing the number of slaves and the size of estates. This monopolization of the land led to a depopulation of the Italian countryside. Many peasants decided that they could live on the dole in Rome easier than they could win a living from the soil. As Seneca wrote about AD 50, country districts which were once the plowlands of whole villages are now worked by a single band of slaves, and the power of stewards is wider than the realms of kings. He also wrote, "Great troops of slaves, whom their owner does not know by sight, and the slave prisons echoing to the sound of the lash, have no attraction for me." Elsewhere, the situation was even worse. Pliny tells us that in the time of Nero, AD 54 to 68, 6 men held half the province of Africa. Conditions became worse after 50 BC, when Italy's industry, which had previously produced metal products and tasteless pottery for export, was unable to compete successfully with the industrial activity of the provinces, especially Gaul. One cause of this may be found in the fact that craftsmen of Italy were mostly slaves, while those of Gaul were largely free. As a result of this, commerce, which had been flourishing under the Republic, began to decrease under the Empire, the imperial trade being replaced, to a considerable extent, by local and provincial commerce, except for the trade in luxury goods and in grain. The latter continued to pour into Italy from the provinces, especially from Egypt, which was also the source of papyrus. Under the Republic, Italy still paid for these imports by metal goods, redware pottery, and other products, but under the Empire, Italian exports decreased in importance, and imports had to be paid for in gold or silver. This began a steady flow of precious metals from Italy, especially from Rome, to the provinces. These metals had to be brought back by new conquests extending the frontiers and by ransacking of the provinces by the provincial governors and armies. Thus the army, the imperialist wars, and the corruption in provincial government were necessary for the economic survival of the Roman system. Plunder kept the system functioning, until the military weakening of Rome made it impossible to extend the frontiers further, and neither the supply of psi nor the restoration of specie could be maintained. Thus, by 146 BC, the Roman state had become the universal empire of classical civilization, although it required another century and a half before class conflicts and imperialist wars were reduced in frequency. The class conflicts led to the so-called civil wars that ended with the triumph of Augustus Caesar in 31 BC. The imperialist wars continued as Roman attacks on outside peoples and led to the conquest of Gaul, of Egypt, and of Britain. By AD 96, the universal empire of classical civilization had reached its golden age, a sub-period that continued for about 3 generations, 96 to 180, under the 5 good emperors. Of this period, Gibbon wrote, "If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the ascension of Commodus. But as Gibbon knew well, it needed but a slight change for this golden prosperity to become the brown of overripeness and decay." Decay. By AD 200, classical civilization had reached its period of decay. With the end of continual warfare and the clear inability of Rome's military forces to extend its frontiers further, the supply of both slaves and booty ceased. The unfavorable balance of payments of Italy became more acute. Trade began to decrease sharply, and a tendency for each province, even each large estate, to move toward economic self-sufficiency began. There was a return to grain growing in Italy. Craft activities began to move from the towns to the estates. The towns themselves ceased to grow and later declined. The decreasing supply of slaves and the exodus of free persons from the town to the countryside gradually brought about an agrarian reorganization in which the landlords began to work their estates with tenants, requiring payment in kind and labor services on their own holdings as part of the rent. These tenants were called coloni. Efforts to overcome the chronic economic depression by government action led to a much enlarged governmental bureaucracy and to an increased tax burden. This fell primarily on the landlords because of the dwindling commercial and craft activities, because the army was no longer paying its way from the booty of war, but remained an expensive financial burden, and because landed wealth was something the tax collector could lay his hands on. The scarcity of manpower and the effort of tenants to move from one landlord to another seeking better terms gave the landlords an excuse for refusing to pay taxes. To obviate such excuses, laws were passed forbidding the coloni to move from their tenancies, making these hereditary and making the landlord responsible for his tenants' taxes, since he could be found by the tax collector more easily than they could, and his lands would be surety for payment. Thus the coloni tended to become serfs. In time, they tended to look to the landlord for protection and for settlement of their disputes. At the same time, as the government became weaker and more remote, the free villagers, or vici, also began to look toward powerful local landlords for these same services of protection and justice. The government passed laws to prevent this growing system of patronage, but without stopping it. The decline of slavery led to decreased accumulation of capital, but investment, as we have seen, had declined earlier and more rapidly. The vital issue was no longer expansion, but survival. The political disorders of the 3rd century can be measured by one fact. In 16 years, 46 emperors, or would-be emperors, met death by violence. Such disorders intensified in the 4th and following centuries by the barbarian migrations, led to a flight from the towns to the country. Everyone wanted an established relationship to the food-producing land. As all municipal life decreased in vigor, agrarian units increased in self-sufficiency. The shift of real power from the Senate to the armies began as early as 100 BC, but was not legally recognized until AD 195, when, for the first time, an emperor ruled without any senatorial election. control of the imperial position became a clear power struggle between army commanders. Because such commanders could no longer retain the loyalty of their forces by periodic distribution of provincial booty and foreign slaves, they rewarded them from the chief remaining source of wealth, the landed holdings of their political opponents. This gradual liquidation of the landed class and their replacement by army leaders, sprung from the more remote and backward areas of the empire, entirely destroyed the town-dwelling landed elite who had been the carriers of the classical culture. As this aristocratic, clarid, urban, moderate, mundane culture was destroyed, it was replaced by a welter of unprincipled violence, grasping materialism, crass ignorance, crude illiteracy, and narrow rural provincialism. In reaction against this, there eventually arose a new spiritualism and aestheticism, a flight from worldliness mingled with all kinds of new religious feelings and dark superstitions, but also containing much exalted spirituality. Both of these movements were fatal to the classical ideology. In fact, it became increasingly difficult to find anyone with allegiance to the classical idea, and certainly no one was willing to sacrifice or die for it. Yet without its ideology, no culture can survive. Invasion. As the classical civilization grew weaker, its ability to maintain its integrity by defending its frontiers decreased. After these frontiers were established along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, the Red Sea, and the northern edge of the Sahara, they could not be expanded outward. This stopped the supply of slaves and booty that kept the whole economic system functioning. Efforts were made to push Roman rule across the Rhine, or as far as the Tigris, or across the Red Sea, or even across the Sahara, but all such efforts ultimately failed. As a matter of fact, Rome had increased difficulty defending these long-established frontiers themselves. This difficulty arose from a number of factors. Rome itself was getting weaker. Its ideology was losing allegiance everywhere. Morale was evaporating. The economic system was declining. The political system was finding it increasingly difficult to get its orders obeyed. The social system was disintegrating. Even the army was becoming completely institutionalized, consisting largely of permanent garrisons recruited from barbarians, with only local interests, and surely no interest in seeking death for the classical idea, or even for the Roman state. At the same time, military problems were changing. Originally, Roman infantry was pushing into barbarian territory. Later, barbarian horsemen were raiding into imperial territory. Ultimately, whole barbarian tribes were migrating into the empire itself. The inability of the famous Roman legion to withstand charging horsemen made Rome indefensible. Rome had not had to face this problem earlier, because adequate rain on the northern grasslands, century after century, reduced the tendency for barbarians to move. But decreased rainfall after AD 200 created a pressure of moving pastoral peoples that became irresistible. The final blow here was the pressure of the Huns out of the Asiatic steppes and on the horse-riding Germans along the Roman Danube frontier. The Gothic victory over the Roman army at Adrianople in 378 showed clearly that the final crisis had been reached. What could be done? The situation both of the Roman state and of classical culture was hopeless unless the defensive forces could be shifted quickly from infantry to cavalry. This was impossible, not only for the lack of experience in the techniques of cavalry warfare, but equally because the weakened classical economic system could not support a large number of horses. Horses, a grain-eating animal, compete for food directly with men. The inefficiency of the classical Mediterranean economy, based on an institutionalized slave system, could not produce such a surplus. Yet without cavalry, the society could not resist the intruding barbarians. In fact, the crisis was more fundamental than the simple fact of military defense. No one any longer had faith in the classical ideology or in the classical gods. A new ideology and a new religion were needed. Though they were already at hand in Christianity, They could not be fitted into the classical culture with which they were fundamentally incompatible. A new technology was needed and was also available. It would be based on a deep plowing with properly harnessed draft animals by persons who would have an interest in doing a good job, because any additional output arising from increased care would accrue to themselves. But such a technology was much better adapted to the well-watered, heavy soils north of the Alps in the zones of summer crops than it was to the thin, seasonally watered light soils of the winter-growing Mediterranean. A new military technique was also available. Based on heavy cavalry, armed with impact weapons and equipped with strong horses, stirrups, and horseshoes. This technique was extremely expensive in terms of grain consumption, so that one fighting man had to be supported by 100 or more tillers of the soil. Here again, the areas north of the Alps, with their more productive grain fields and more adequate grasslands, were far better able to support the new system than the older Mediterranean area. The bringing together to form a single culture of these various techniques for satisfying man's basic needs required a new society. Classical society could not do it. When these came together north of the Alps, in the peripheral zone of classical society, there appeared the core area of a new Western culture. But at the same time, in the old core area of classical society, in the Aegean, sufficiently profound changes occurred in classical culture to permit a variant of it to survive for another 1,000 years. This gives rise to one of the greatest puzzles of analytical history. Was Byzantine culture a new society, or was it merely a revived classical culture? Or is it possible that Byzantine culture is an earlier phase of Orthodox, that is Russian, civilization? In view of the fact that Byzantine culture had a different religion, ideology, social organization, military and economic technology, and almost certainly a different organization of expansion, it seems difficult to regard it as simply a reformed classical culture. Its relative continuity in politics and law is not that significant. On the other hand, it hardly seems feasible to regard Byzantium as a wholly new civilization. Its brief life of about 1,000 years would make it a rival with Hittite society for the position of the shortest-lived of all civilizations. Whatever decision is made in this difficult problem is bound to be unsatisfactory from many points of view. Just as a mass of quartz at the junction of two or more crystals cannot be attributed to one or another with any assurance. On the other hand, the fissure in the West between classical culture and Western civilization is quite clear. The death of one society and the birth of an entirely new civilization in the peripheral area of a previous one is quite definite. On every level of culture, from the most material technology on one extreme to the most abstract ideology or religion on the other extreme, these two civilizations are different.